Tonight, we'll take a slow, gentle journey back in time to explore what life was really like for patients living in an asylum during the 1800s. We'll step inside those walls and discover the daily routines, sounds, smells, and feelings that shaped their days and nights. Together, we'll listen to the stories of a world very different from our own, one filled with struggle, hope, and quiet moments. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down where are you watching from and at what time. So, settle in and let's begin this journey into the past. It usually began with the cold. That kind of chill that sank through the fabric of your clothes, past your skin, and nestled deep into your bones. You'd feel it before your eyes even opened. No warm sunlight greeted you. The windows, high and small, barely let in more than a sliver of morning grey. The glass, smudged and foggy from the breath of countless nights, distorted everything outside. So, even if there was sunlight, you wouldn't know. The bed was hard. A thin mattress stuffed with horsehair or straw, flattened from years of use. It didn't offer comfort, just something to lie on, and even that felt more like a slab than a resting place. The sheets were stiff and rough, made from linen that had been washed and re-washed until the fibers began to fray. If you were lucky, they were dry. If you weren't, they were damp with sweat, or worse, someone else's. The blanket scratched your skin and was too thin to chase the cold from your limbs. Pillows were rare. If you had one, it was often small, lumpy, and smelled faintly of mildew or something you couldn't quite place. The first sounds of the day came slowly. A distant clatter of footsteps echoing in long, tiled hallways. Doors opening. Keys jangling. A shout from another room. Sometimes a moan, or the raspy voice of someone muttering to themselves. There was never silence. Not really. Even at night, the asylum murmured to itself. Walls creaked, floors groaned, and patients cried or whispered things only they understood. But in the early morning, those whispers grew louder as the day stretched awake. If you were in the shared ward, you'd hear the shuffling of other patients, some coughing, others just staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. Maybe someone had already wet the bed and was crying softly, afraid of the punishment that might follow. Maybe someone else was laughing, a high, thin laugh that had no joy in it. The air was thick, not just with the smell, but with that strange sense of being watched. The feeling that eyes were always on you. Even when you thought you were alone, you weren't. Someone, an attendant, another patient, or just the building itself, was always there. You felt it like a weight pressing down on your chest. The room around you was bare. Plain walls, usually painted a yellowed white or dull grey, with chipping paint and stains that no one bothered to scrub. A few iron-framed beds lined up in rows, each exactly the same, each too close to the next. No personal belongings, no photos, no colour. Sometimes a single chair sat in the corner, but most of the time, there wasn't even that. You had nothing to call your own. The floor might be wood, worn and grooved by years of pacing feet. Or tile, cold and cracked, always echoing every step like a drumbeat. The ceiling overhead seemed too high, especially when you were lying on your back, unable to sleep. You might count the cracks or try to find shapes in the stains. Anything to keep your mind busy, because if you let it wander too far, it could slip into places you didn't want it to go. And then came the light. Faint at first, then stronger as someone opened the hallway doors. Lanterns. Maybe a candle. Or, if the asylum was more modern, gaslights flickering with a hiss. That artificial glow spread slowly across the floor, announcing that the day had started. It wasn't a peaceful wake-up. No gentle nudging, no kind words. Just the sense that something was about to happen, and that you had no say in what it would be. You didn't get to sleep in. You didn't stretch and take your time. You sat up when you were told. Or you were pulled up. Or shouted at until your eyes snapped open and your heart started racing. Every morning began like this. With uncertainty. With tension. With the knowledge that whatever the day brought, it was out of your control. Sometimes the worst part of waking up wasn't the cold, or the noise, or the way your back ached from the mattress. It was the realization that you had woken up at all, that the night hadn't taken you, that you were still here, still trapped behind those thick walls, still just another patient among dozens, sometimes hundreds, who were barely seen as people anymore. And yet, You had no choice. You got up, because that was what was expected. You didn't fight it, not unless you wanted trouble. You sat on the edge of your bed, feet brushing the icy floor, arms wrapped around your middle, waiting. For the bell. For the call. For someone to decide what happened next. You waited, because that's all you could do. The first thing that hit your nose in the morning, before your eyes were even fully open, was the smell. It wasn't just one smell, not really. It was a layered thing. A fog of scents that floated through the long corridors and clung to your clothes, your skin, even your breath. The asylum had its own unique scent, one that never quite left you. It was always there, in the background, like the hum of silence in a sealed room. The mornings brought out a very specific combination. Some parts were sharp, others dull and lingering. There was the strong, stinging odor of carbolic acid, the most common disinfectant used in the 1800s. It was poured across floors, splashed against the corners of wards, and soaked into rags that attendants used to scrub down bedpans or clean up messes. It smelled almost like a bitter tar, sour and chemical, astringent enough to make your eyes water if you got too close. Some patients gagged on it, especially the older ones or those whose lungs were already weakened by years of confinement. It got in your throat and made everything taste like metal. Under that biting sharpness was something else, something heavier. Human. The smell of unwashed bodies was unavoidable. No matter how many pails of water they brought out or how often they scrubbed the floors, there was no hiding it. The sweat of too many people in too small a space, the grease of hair that hadn't seen proper soap in weeks, sometimes months. Patients were rarely allowed hot water, and bathing wasn't always regular. You could go days, maybe even weeks, without a proper wash. So bodies built up that stale, sour scent. Not just one body, but dozens. Old clothes worn over and over again. Skin crusted from scratching or bed sores. Breath that turned musty from poor diets and worse dental care. Then there were the accidents. People who wet themselves in the night. People too afraid to call for help. People who screamed or sobbed so much that they vomited from the effort. In the corners of the shared wards, sometimes tucked beneath a bed or near the walls, there were stains. Even if they were scrubbed away, the smell stayed. Faint but lingering, like an echo of something rotting slowly, beneath the surface. And of course, the linens. Damp sheets, some soiled from nighttime confusion, others simply holding onto the constant mix of sweat, drool, or worse. Laundry was done, but never quickly enough, and almost never thoroughly. In the morning, the scent of boiled water and lye soap from the washing area would drift faintly through the halls, mixing with the filth it was supposed to be fighting. The soap itself smelled harsh and gritty, like chalk mixed with ash, and was never enough to cover what it needed to. You might also smell blood. Maybe from someone who had scratched at their own skin all night. Or someone who'd bitten their tongue during a fit. Or a woman, bleeding monthly without proper sanitation. There was no privacy for that. Rags were reused. Nothing smelled clean. Not truly. At times, depending on the ward, the air held a sour, vinegary note. This came from the solution used to mop the wooden floors. It didn't hide the stench, it simply added to the bouquet. Vinegar, carbolic acid, sweat, urine, vomit, blood. Mixed in with the mildew growing in damp corners, and the ever-present cold that left everything a little musty, a little wet, a little sick. There were more subtle things too. The sourness of spoiled milk, if it had been spilled and gone unnoticed. The faint whiff of cooked oats or stale bread drifting in from the kitchen if the wind blew just right. The smoky tang of the coal-burning stove somewhere far away. The scent of candle wax, faint and oily, mixed with the soot it left behind. The tang of rust from metal bed frames, especially the old ones that were chipped and flaked. Even the fabric of the uniforms, coarse and stiff, had a scent. Dust and body heat, sweat soaked in over time. Sometimes you would smell something sweet, but not in a pleasant way. More like the sweetness of something turning. The cloying, sticky scent of decay, faint but unmistakable. It came from people who hadn't been moved in a while. People left in beds for too long. People whose skin had begun to break down, quietly, without anyone noticing. Or perhaps they noticed, and simply didn't have time to care. The building itself seemed to breathe these scents. The walls absorbed them. The wooden beams overhead held onto them. You could scrub and wash, rinse and mop, but the smell never left. Some patients became numb to it. After a while, you stopped noticing the full bouquet unless it changed. You only reacted when something new entered the mix. Something off. A stronger ammonia sting, maybe. Or the iron scent of fresh blood. Or the unmistakable, earthy stink of fear sweat. To live in an asylum was to live in this cloud of smells every single day. It filled your nose, even when you tried to breathe through your mouth. It clung to your skin and settled in your clothes. If you were ever lucky enough to leave, even just for a moment, you would carry it with you. People outside would wrinkle their noses, unsure of what it was, just knowing it didn't smell right. But inside, it was normal. Expected. Part of the air you breathed. The taste in your mouth. The fog that filled every room, every hallway, every stairwell. In the mornings, the smell was thickest. Before the windows were opened, if they were opened at all. Before the breakfast trays came. Before the laundry was changed. It was always worse then. Like the asylum had steeped in itself overnight and was just now beginning to uncurl, to stretch, to exhale everything it had been holding on to. And you couldn't escape it. You could turn your face, try to breathe against the blanket, try to bury your nose in your own sleeve, but it didn't matter. The smell was part of the asylum. Part of you. There was no clean air, no fresh scent, no open field of flowers or morning dew. Just this. Just the morning air of a place that didn't see its patients as people. Just the scent of confinement, soaked into the stone and brick and skin. The mornings began not with warmth or comfort, but with the sound of keys jangling in a lock and the loud, firm footsteps of attendants walking down the corridor. The doors didn't swing open gently, they creaked or clanged depending on their condition, and the metal latches scraped against their housings. There wasn't a knock, and there was certainly no privacy. The day started when they said it did, no matter how tired you were or how poorly you'd slept the night before. The first voice you heard was often sharp, calling out orders. Up. Now. Stand. The expectation wasn't kindness. It was compliance. Some patients moved quickly out of habit or fear, others slower, needing help or a shove. If you were slow to rise, one of the attendants might grab your shoulder, push you up, or even yank the blankets from your body to jolt you into motion. There was no room for lingering or curling back under the covers. Morning meant movement. You sat up on the hard mattress, usually still stiff from the chill of the night. If the blanket had managed to stay on through the tossing and turning, it was often scratchy, sometimes damp from either sweat or the condensation that settled in the cold room. The sheets were usually rough, off-white, stained from years of use. They smelled faintly of lye and something earthier beneath. You pulled your feet onto the cold floor, the boards either splintery or slick with the remnants of the overnight mop. Washing was a group affair, and it wasn't gentle or pleasant. There was no sink of your own. No mirror, no soap with a pleasant scent, no warm towel waiting for you. You followed a slow-moving line down a hall or across the ward to a washroom that smelled of soap, metal, old water, and the ever-present mildew that clung to the cracks in the floor. Some asylums had a long communal basin where several patients could wash at once, dipping their hands into cold water that had already been used a dozen times over. Others had individual basins brought to bedsides, but the water was still cold, and shared cloths meant that what passed for cleanliness was more about appearance than hygiene. Attendants might hand you a small bar of rough soap, if it was a good day, or just splash water at you and bark at you to clean yourself faster. The soap stung if you had any cuts or scratches. It left your skin feeling dry, chalky, almost squeaky. You rubbed at your face, your arms, your neck. No one expected you to get fully clean. There wasn't time. And if you lingered, someone behind you in line would complain or push you along. There were patients who couldn't wash themselves, whether because of their condition, physical limitations, or simple confusion. They were sometimes scrubbed down by attendants, but it wasn't done with tenderness. It was brisk, harsh, and often left red marks. The water was cold in winter, icy enough to sting fingers. In the summer, it was still cold but didn't burn in the same way. The air was rarely warm enough to dry you fully, and so your clothes clung to damp skin. That feeling would stay with you the rest of the morning. Dressing came next. The clothes were always the same, coarse, faded, and utilitarian. Most patients had a uniform of sorts, though the exact cut and style varied slightly between asylums. For men, it was usually a loose shirt made from heavy cotton or coarse wool, often a dull grey, brown, or faded blue. The trousers were shapeless and cinched with a drawstring or a thick belt if you were allowed one. Women often wore plain dresses that reached mid-calf or ankle, made of the same stiff fabric, sometimes with a small apron. The colours were muted, neutral, with no decoration. No buttons or zippers, nothing that could be removed and used to harm oneself or others. The fabric was never soft. It rubbed at the skin, especially under the arms and behind the knees. Some patients developed rashes from it. And if your clothes were torn, stained, or too large or small, you were expected to make do. Everything was reused. Laundered once a week, maybe. You might have worn those same clothes for 3 days straight. Sometimes longer. Shoes were worn by some, but not all. Many were given soft slippers, made of cloth and rope, that wore down quickly and did little to protect feet from cold or rough surfaces. In some wards, patients walked barefoot, especially those considered dangerous or unpredictable. Barefootedness made it harder to run, harder to kick, and easier to control. Once washed and dressed, patients were lined up or grouped in the ward. Depending on the asylum's routine, this could be a quiet, resigned time or a chaotic mess. Some people paced. Some muttered to themselves. Some cried without warning. Others stood silently, still wrapped in the confusion of dreams or nightmares. You weren't allowed to sit once you were up. You stood or walked in slow circles, waiting for the next order. Attendants walked up and down the line, checking that clothes were properly on, faces were washed enough, and shoes were on the right feet. Sometimes they shouted. Sometimes they didn't say a word, just glared. The patients learned to read those expressions, to sense whether today would be a quiet day or a bad one. Breakfast came next, and with it, the call to move. This was the beginning of the day, not with any clock, not with sunlight through clean windows, but with the shuffling of feet toward the dining hall, the rattling of tin trays, and the low murmur of dozens of voices waking together in one place. There was no comfort in the morning. No sense of ease. Just motion, orders, and the routine that repeated itself with grim regularity. A start to another day that looked just like the one before, and would look just like the one to follow. Roll call was not just a count, it was a ritual of control. It came after the early morning routine and just before breakfast, a time that felt heavy and rigid, not because of any clock but because of how everything moved with a kind of mechanical regularity. The roll call was often done in a large open area of the ward or sometimes even within the hallway outside the sleeping quarters. Patients were ordered to line up or stand beside their beds, depending on the space and the staff's preference. The head attendant or a nurse would hold a clipboard, usually with a list of every name, every patient assigned to that particular section of the asylum. The names were read out loud one by one. The tone was flat, sometimes bored, sometimes sharp, always loud enough to cut through the fog of sleep and silence. One by one, a patient's name would echo through the hall. If you heard your name, you were expected to respond immediately. A present was enough, or a raised hand, a nod. For those who couldn't speak, due to trauma, disability, or deep depression, a visual signal was accepted, sometimes reluctantly. If you didn't respond quickly, someone might yell your name again, louder, sharper. Still no answer. They might walk over and shake your shoulder or lift your chin to force eye contact. If you were in bed, too ill or weak to stand, they marked you specially and moved on. If you'd wandered off or were hiding, the search began, quick and cold and full of suspicion. Each count was meticulous. Sometimes it was repeated multiple times if the numbers didn't match. Attendants didn't take risks. A missing patient meant a problem. Even if you had just gone to the wrong side of the room, even if you had misunderstood an order, it could be treated as a small rebellion. And rebellion, even a small one, was not tolerated. Standing there, shoulder to shoulder with the others, you could feel the tension. Some patients swayed on their feet, exhausted or sedated. Others stared straight ahead, their eyes vacant. A few whispered to themselves, repeating words or fragments of memories, lost in their own echo chamber. There were those who muttered names that weren't theirs or answered for others just to be noticed. They were corrected harshly. The attendants didn't care why someone responded wrongly, only that it disrupted the order. You stood there and waited, trying not to move too much, trying not to draw attention. The longer it took, the heavier the silence became. And it was rarely truly silent. Someone always wept softly. Someone always muttered. There were the faint dragging sounds of slippers on the wooden floor. The echo of voices from another wing. Sometimes, a sudden cry from down the hall. All of it soaked into the wooden walls like old water stains. Never gone, always lingering. And what did it feel like? To be counted? It wasn't like being included. It wasn't like being seen. It was being numbered. It was being marked like livestock, inventory. You were one of many. A dot on a page. A body in a room. They didn't care how you felt, only that you were accounted for. There was no joy in hearing your name, no comfort. For some, it was a painful reminder of identity, something they tried to forget or something that had been stolen from them long ago. For others, it was the only time their name was spoken all day, and even then, it wasn't said with care. Sometimes you looked down the row at others and wondered how many of them remembered who they were. How many knew the year or even the day? Some stared back, blinking slowly, faces slack. Others gripped their hands tightly or twitched at sudden noises. You weren't allowed to talk, not during the count. You weren't allowed to question. Just stand, wait, listen, respond, then stay silent. If the count was wrong, if even one patient was unaccounted for, it could become an ordeal. The attendants would snap. The mood would shift instantly. Doors might be locked. Rooms searched. Punishments could follow. Not just for the one who wandered off but for others too, as a warning. If the count took too long, breakfast was delayed. Tempers rose. The weight of the morning pressed heavier on your shoulders. And once it was done, once the list was checked and double-checked, the command to move came again. Breakfast. But you never truly left that head count behind. It stayed with you. It was the daily reminder that you were not a person in full, just one more presence on a clipboard, expected to stand still, say yes, and disappear into the shuffle of another long, slow day. Breakfast in an 1800s asylum was a ritual that combined necessity with strict control, a moment where the institutional nature of the place was undeniable. The dining hall was often a large, stark room with long wooden tables and benches lined up in rows. The walls might be bare or adorned with simple, faded paint, sometimes showing signs of damp or neglect. The windows were usually tall but barred, letting in cold morning light filtered through grime. The air was heavy with a mix of anticipation, fatigue, and the lingering odors of the ward. When the attendants ushered the patients into the dining hall, there was little room for comfort or conversation. Patients were expected to walk quietly, in an orderly fashion, and sit where they were told. No chairs were usually moved. Everyone had a fixed spot that reinforced the routine and hierarchy within the asylum. The mood was often subdued. Many patients were still waking from restless or troubled nights, their faces pale, eyes tired. The breakfast itself was simple, plain, and not particularly appetizing. The typical fare included thin porridge made from oats or cornmeal, served lukewarm in metal bowls. The porridge was often bland, sometimes gritty from poorly ground grains or leftover residue from previous batches. Occasionally, bread was served, hard, dense slices that tasted stale or dry. Butter was a rarity, and jam or other spreads were almost never seen. Tea or weak coffee might be provided, but it was usually watery and bitter, lacking any real warmth or flavor. Some asylums served a watery broth instead, barely nourishing and far from comforting. Patients ate with simple utensils, often a spoon or a wooden fork, sometimes nothing but their hands if cutlery was scarce or broken. The sound of scraping bowls, clinking spoons, and occasional coughing filled the hall, but conversation was discouraged. Patients were expected to eat quietly and quickly. Talking was limited to murmurs or whispered exchanges between familiar faces, while newcomers or more withdrawn patients often sat in silence, overwhelmed by the strange, oppressive atmosphere. There was a rigid expectation of behavior during breakfast. Patients were told to sit upright, keep their hands visible on the table or in their laps, and avoid fidgeting or loud noises. The attendants, often standing at the ends of tables or patrolling the room, watched closely for signs of disorder or disobedience. Any patient who attempted to leave early, speak out of turn, or cause a disturbance was immediately reprimanded, sometimes with harsh words, sometimes with physical force. For many patients, breakfast was more than just a meal. It was a reminder of their confinement and loss of autonomy. The food itself, often tasteless and meager, offered little comfort. Some patients might have felt hunger pangs afterward, or the frustration of a body that wasn't being truly cared for. Others might have been too sedated or depressed to eat much at all, their plates left mostly untouched under the watchful eyes of the staff. The atmosphere in the dining hall during breakfast was a blend of quiet desperation and enforced order. It was a place where individuals, many suffering deeply, were corralled into a routine designed more for the ease of the institution than for their well-being. The bland food, the strict rules, and the cold, clinical setting all combined to reinforce a sense of powerlessness and uniformity. For some, the act of eating was a struggle, not just physically but emotionally. The lack of warmth, both in the food and in the environment, made the experience isolating. Others might have found fleeting moments of connection, sharing a glance or a small smile with someone sitting nearby, but these moments were rare and fragile. Ultimately, breakfast in the asylum was a quiet ceremony of survival, marking the beginning of another long day behind locked doors. The shared ward where patients slept was often the heart of the asylum's physical reality, a place that embodied both the confinement and neglect that marked much of institutional life in the 1800s. Imagine a vast room, sometimes the size of a small hall, housing dozens of beds arranged in rows or sometimes just scattered about with minimal order. The walls, usually made of cold, bare brick or plaster, were often cracked or stained from years of dampness and wear. The paint peeled in places, revealing a faded color underneath, adding to the overall sense of decay. The beds themselves were typically simple wooden frames, functional but not built for comfort. The mattresses were thin, stuffed with straw or horsehair, and worn down by use. They offered little cushioning and often smelled faintly of dust and mildew. The sheets were coarse, usually made from rough linen or cotton, threadbare in many cases. Blankets, if given, were heavy woolen throws that felt scratchy against the skin. Many patients found the beds cold and unforgiving, especially during the harsh winters when the asylum's heating was minimal or non-existent. Springs creaked under any movement, and the wooden slats sometimes groaned, echoing across the quiet room. Windows in the shared ward were tall and narrow, placed high up on the walls to prevent escape. They were fitted with thick iron bars, a constant visual reminder of the prison-like nature of the asylum. Glass panes were often dirty or fogged, blurring the outside world into vague shapes of sky and tree branches. On grey or rainy days, the light that filtered through was dim and pale, casting long shadows across the room. At night, the windows became black voids, and the ward would feel even more isolated from the world beyond. The floors were usually made of wooden planks or sometimes cold stone, and were rarely spotless. Dust and dirt settled into cracks, and with many patients moving about, footsteps echoed unevenly. The floorboards creaked under weight, adding a constant low hum to the background noise. Sometimes, dampness seeped in through the walls or floor, making the air chillier and causing the occasional musty smell that lingered despite the cleaning. Beds were placed close together, sometimes so near that patients could barely move without brushing against their neighbor. Privacy was non-existent. The ward was a collective space where personal boundaries vanished. This closeness bred discomfort and tension among patients, especially those who were agitated or sensitive. The noise from one restless sleeper, shouting, crying, or pacing, carried easily through the room, disturbing others who struggled to find rest. Personal belongings were sparse. Patients might have had a small bag or a few items stored under their bed or on a small shelf if they were lucky. But many arrived with nothing, and the asylum's rules limited what they could keep. The overall condition of the ward was one of neglect, not overtly dirty, but certainly far from clean or welcoming. The furniture was worn, the walls faded, and the atmosphere heavy with the collective weight of despair and uncertainty. The ward was lit during the day by the weak sunlight through barred windows, and at night by dim oil lamps or gas lights. The lighting was harsh and uneven, sometimes casting long, eerie shadows that unsettled even the calmest patients. The ceiling was high, amplifying every sound, creating a cavernous effect that made the room feel even colder and emptier. This shared sleeping space was a place where rest was often elusive. The discomfort of the beds, the noise, the smells, and the overwhelming sense of confinement combined to make sleep a struggle. Patients tossed and turned, some murmured or cried out in their sleep, others lay still but restless, trapped in their minds and bodies. The ward was a microcosm of the asylum itself, a place that offered minimal comfort and maximum control, a shared space that erased individuality and underscored the harsh reality of institutional life. For many patients, the ward was a place of loneliness despite the presence of so many others. The close quarters did not foster community so much as a tense coexistence, where each person grappled with their own struggles under the watchful eyes of the attendants and the ever-present bars on the windows. The shared ward was both a physical and psychological cage, a daily reminder of confinement, and a backdrop for countless stories of pain, hope, and endurance. The asylum attendants were a constant and imposing presence within the institution, shaping the daily lives of patients through their actions, attitudes, and authority. Their uniforms were often designed to convey order and control, a visual symbol of their power over the patients. Typically, attendants wore dark, stiff, and somewhat utilitarian clothing, heavy woolen jackets or coats in navy blue, black, or dark grey. The jackets were usually buttoned up to the collar, with brass buttons that glinted in the dim light of the asylum halls. Beneath, white or faded shirts with collars peeked out, sometimes paired with plain neckties or scarves. Their trousers were similarly somber in color, and sturdy boots completed the ensemble, designed for practicality over comfort. Some attendants wore hats, usually flat caps or simple felt hats, depending on the institution's regulations. These uniforms were intended to distinguish attendants from patients clearly, asserting authority and detachment. The clothing was rarely clean or fresh, worn and stained from the rigors of their work, but the overall effect was of a rigid, uniformed orderliness that contrasted starkly with the disarray of the wards. Attendants acted with an air of control and discipline. Many had been trained in institutional care, but standards varied widely between asylums. Some attendants were harsh and authoritarian, enforcing rules with little empathy. Their tone was often brusque, and their demeanor could be cold or even cruel, reflecting the prevailing attitudes of the time towards mental illness. They carried keys, sometimes batons or other tools of control, and patrolled the wards with a watchful gaze, quick to intervene if a patient acted out of line. Other attendants were more resigned or indifferent, performing their duties mechanically without much emotional engagement. They often avoided prolonged interaction with patients, keeping conversations short and utilitarian. While some showed moments of kindness or understanding, these were exceptions rather than the rule, and trust between patients and attendants was generally low. The attendants were, after all, the enforcers of the asylum's strict routines and restrictions. Patients' interactions with attendants were shaped by this power imbalance. Most patients approached attendants with a mix of fear, hope, and resignation. Some tried to curry favor by following rules closely, hoping for small rewards or better treatment. Others were wary or hostile, having experienced rough treatment or witnessing punishment. When patients spoke to attendants, they often did so cautiously, aware that any perceived disrespect could lead to reprimand or restraint. Attendants controlled many aspects of patients' lives: when they ate, when they bathed, when they moved about the asylum. Their authority extended to deciding who could go outside, who received special privileges, and who faced punishment or restraint. This control was absolute. Patients knew that resistance was often futile and could lead to harsher consequences. Despite their authoritative role, attendants were often overworked and understaffed, leading to frustration and occasional neglect. Some took out their stress on patients, while others became withdrawn themselves, caught in the bleak environment of the asylum. Patients sometimes observed the attendants' fatigue or harshness and reacted with a complex mix of sympathy and fear. Overall, the attendants were both guardians and jailers. They maintained the order of the asylum but also embodied the oppressive nature of the institution. For patients, they were figures of authority to be feared, respected, or sometimes quietly despised. The dynamic between attendants and patients was a constant negotiation of power, control, and survival within the harsh realities of 19th-century asylum life. Patients in 1800s asylums typically wore clothing that was simple, uniform, and designed more for ease of management and control than for comfort or personal expression. The materials were coarse and heavy, chosen for durability rather than softness. Most garments were made from rough cotton or wool blends, fabrics that felt scratchy and stiff against the skin, often irritating to those with sensitive or delicate complexions. The coarse texture added to the discomfort many patients experienced, especially after days of continuous wear without frequent changes. The color of the clothing was usually muted and utilitarian. Shades of gray, dull blue, or brown predominated. Sometimes patients were assigned specific colors or markings depending on their status or diagnosis, a system meant to quickly identify individuals but which also added to the sense of dehumanization. For example, some asylums use stripes or patches sewn onto the fabric to distinguish patients from staff or to indicate particular classifications. This stripped away any sense of individuality and reinforced the institutional atmosphere. The clothing often consisted of loose-fitting shirts or blouses with long sleeves, paired with trousers for men and plain skirts or dresses for women. The garments were typically shapeless, lacking tailoring or refinement, emphasizing function over fashion. Buttons were sturdy but rough, sometimes difficult to fasten, and collars were stiff or non-existent. Patients were sometimes given simple caps or head coverings, particularly in colder weather, made of the same coarse materials. Wearing these clothes felt confining yet strangely impersonal. The scratchy fabric and stiff seams made movement uncomfortable, especially when patients were confined indoors for long hours. The weight of the woolen blankets and heavy garments could feel oppressive, particularly during warmer seasons when the lack of ventilation made the clothing feel hot and suffocating. At the same time, the uniformity eliminated any personal choice, removing a vital outlet for self-expression and identity. Many patients reported feeling like they were wearing a prison rather than clothing, a daily reminder of their confinement and loss of freedom. Laundry was infrequent, meaning clothes often smelled stale or carried the faint odors of the asylum itself. Patches and repairs were common, adding to the worn and shabby appearance. Because of limited supplies, patients sometimes had to wear the same outfit for weeks at a time, exacerbating discomfort and feelings of neglect. Footwear was minimal and basic, usually heavy boots or sturdy shoes designed to withstand the rigors of institutional life rather than provide comfort. Socks, if worn, were thick and rough. Many patients went barefoot indoors or wore simple slippers provided by the asylum, which added to the cold and harshness of the environment. Overall, the clothing worn by patients was a physical symbol of their reduced status. It marked them as inmates rather than individuals, emphasizing conformity and control. The daily experience of wearing these heavy, uncomfortable, and uniform garments reinforced the restrictive atmosphere of the asylum and contributed to the mental and emotional challenges patients faced. The roughness of the fabric, the dull colors, and the lack of choice in attire were constant reminders that patients were stripped of personal freedoms, even in something as basic as the clothes they wore each day. In the morning, once patients had completed their basic routines of washing and dressing, many were assigned chores or activities designed both to occupy their time and, supposedly, to aid in their therapy. These tasks varied depending on the asylum's philosophy and resources, but generally included simple manual labor and crafts like sewing, basket weaving, laundry, or gardening. The idea was that engaging patients in work could provide structure to their days, reduce agitation, and offer a form of occupational therapy, though in practice, it often felt more like forced labor. One common task was sewing or mending clothing and linens. Patients, especially women, were given needles, thread, and scraps of fabric or worn garments to repair. This work required patience and fine motor skills and was thought to instill discipline and concentration. For some, sewing was calming and gave a small sense of accomplishment, but for others, it was tedious and frustrating, especially when done under strict supervision or time pressure. Basket weaving was another frequent activity, often involving strips of wood or reed that patients would weave into baskets, trays, or simple containers. This craft required manual dexterity and could be repetitive, which some found soothing. However, it was sometimes used as a way to keep patients quiet and occupied rather than as genuine therapy. Finished baskets might be sold or used within the asylum, contributing modestly to its economy. Laundry duties were also assigned to certain patients, requiring them to wash clothes, sheets, and towels by hand in large tubs. This was physically demanding and cold work, especially in colder months when water was heated by large boilers. Patients scrubbing laundry endured the smell of stale water, soap, and the faint odor of unwashed garments. This chore was often given to more able-bodied patients and was supervised closely by attendants to ensure order. Other patients might be assigned to cleaning tasks, such as sweeping floors, dusting furniture, or tidying common areas. These chores helped maintain the asylum's hygiene but were often seen as menial labor, sometimes used as punishment or control rather than therapeutic work. In some asylums, gardening was an option for patients, especially during warmer months. Patients tended flower beds, vegetable patches, or lawns within the asylum grounds. This activity offered a rare chance to be outdoors and interact with nature, providing a brief respite from the confinement of indoor wards. Gardening also had a therapeutic intention, as the repetitive tasks and exposure to fresh air were believed to soothe restless minds. Despite the intention to provide meaningful work, the activities often felt monotonous and imposed, lacking personal choice or creativity. Patients were expected to complete assigned tasks within strict schedules and under close supervision. Failure to participate or complete chores could lead to reprimand, withdrawal of privileges, or more severe consequences. For many patients, these morning activities became the measure of their usefulness within the asylum and a key part of their daily identity. While some found comfort in routine and the small sense of accomplishment the tasks provided, others felt trapped in an endless cycle of dull, repetitive labor with little hope of escape or improvement. Stepping outside into the asylum yard was a rare and often bittersweet experience for patients in the 1800s. The yard was typically a large, enclosed space surrounded by high stone walls or iron fences topped with spikes, designed to keep patients within the institution's confines and prevent escape. The gates were heavily locked and closely monitored by attendants, allowing patients only limited and supervised access to the outdoors. The yard itself was often a patchwork of gravel paths, sparse patches of grass, and a few small trees or shrubs, carefully tended but restrained in size and number. Some asylums tried to create a semblance of a garden, planting flowers or maintaining vegetable beds, but the overall environment felt stark and controlled. The ground was uneven in places, worn down by constant foot traffic, and sometimes muddy after rain. The space was usually barren, with no real places to hide or find privacy. Benches might be scattered here and there, but seating was limited and often uncomfortable. The weather played a significant role in shaping the experience of being outside. On cold, grey mornings, the yard could feel harsh and unwelcoming. Biting winds swept through the open space, making patients pull their coarse clothing tighter around themselves. In contrast, sunny days offered moments of warmth and light, with the sun casting shadows of the fence bars across the ground, a constant visual reminder of confinement. Rainy days turned the yard into a muddy, slippery area where patients could feel damp and chilled, sometimes forced to stay inside if conditions were too severe. Strict rules governed time spent in the yard. Patients were allowed outside only during designated periods, usually in small groups and under close supervision by attendants. The yard was not a place for free roaming or play. Running, shouting, or physical contact was often prohibited to prevent agitation or conflict. Patients were expected to walk calmly or sit quietly, with attendants ready to intervene at any sign of disorder. Conversations were hushed, and gestures of friendliness or support were limited by the watchful eyes of staff. Despite these restrictions, the yard offered a precious break from the monotony and confinement of indoor wards. For many patients, the fresh air was a welcome relief, even if the space was small and the rules strict. The sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the breeze provided brief moments of sensory richness absent from the asylum's interior. The sunlight on their faces or the feel of a gentle breeze could stir memories of the outside world, family, freedom, nature, that felt distant and unreachable. Yet, being outside also brought complex emotions. Some patients felt a pang of sadness or despair, acutely aware that this limited space was all they could ever hope to experience of the world beyond the asylum's walls. The enclosing fences and locked gates loomed large in their minds, reminders of captivity and lost liberty. Others found moments of peace or quiet joy, grateful for the simple sensation of grass beneath their feet or sky overhead, even if these moments were brief. For many, the yard was both a sanctuary and a cage. It was a place where the mind could wander, if only for a short while, but also a constant reminder of the barriers, both physical and mental, that confined them. The experience of going outside into the asylum yard was shaped by this tension between fleeting freedom and enduring restriction, between hope and resignation. Every door within the 1800s asylum was more than just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of control and confinement, a constant reminder of the patient's restricted freedom. These doors were typically made of heavy, solid wood reinforced with iron bands and fitted with large, rusted locks that clicked ominously whenever opened or closed. The locks were controlled exclusively by the asylum staff. Patients were never entrusted with keys, nor were they allowed to open these doors themselves under any circumstances. From the moment a patient entered the asylum, the locked doors signified a loss of autonomy. Each corridor, ward, and room was guarded by these doors, which were always kept shut or locked, sealing patients within prescribed boundaries. The sound of a door being locked, heavy bolts sliding into place or metal keys turning, echoed through the hallways, reinforcing the institutional atmosphere and the power staff held over every aspect of patients' lives. Patients would often stand in front of these locked doors, peering through small barred windows or gaps, watching attendants come and go freely while they remained trapped behind barriers. The doors shut tightly against the wooden frames, offering no possibility of opening from the inside. No matter how desperately a patient might have wanted to leave, to roam freely, or simply to explore beyond their immediate environment, these locked doors were unyielding obstacles. The restriction was not just physical but psychological. Knowing that the doors could only be opened by staff created a pervasive sense of powerlessness. Patients learned quickly that attempting to open or tamper with a door could result in punishment, increased surveillance, or even physical restraints. The locked doors became symbols of the rigid structure governing their existence, where every movement was monitored and controlled. Some doors led to common areas like dining halls or recreational yards, which patients could only access during allotted times and always under supervision. Others guarded the more isolated sections of the asylum, restraint rooms, isolation cells, or staff-only areas, where patients were explicitly forbidden. The barriers between wards also meant that patients were often confined to a single section for extended periods, increasing feelings of isolation and monotony. For patients, the locked doors were not just about safety or security as staff claimed, they were about control and containment. The absence of freedom to move independently, to open a door and decide where to go, stripped away an essential part of human dignity and agency. The doors stood as daily reminders that patients were viewed not as individuals capable of self-direction but as subjects to be managed and restricted. This constant presence of locked doors also intensified feelings of anxiety and fear. Some patients might have attempted escape or resisted confinement, only to be caught and further punished. Others internalized their confinement, becoming resigned or despairing over time. The unyielding nature of these locked portals contributed heavily to the sense of imprisonment, reinforcing the harsh reality that freedom was withheld and control was absolute. In essence, the locked doors within the asylum were a physical manifestation of the restrictions placed on every facet of patient life. They symbolized the loss of liberty, the dominance of the institution over the individual, and the enforced compliance expected of those within its walls. No matter the hour, no matter the reason, the locked doors sealed away freedom, shaping the daily experience of life as a patient in an 1800s asylum. Restraint methods in 1800s asylums were harsh tools of control, used to manage patients who were considered disruptive, agitated, or potentially dangerous to themselves or others. These methods were often physical, uncomfortable, and dehumanizing, reflecting the limited understanding of mental illness at the time and the emphasis on containment over care. One of the most common restraint devices was the restraint chair. This heavy wooden chair was built with strong leather straps, attached to the arms, legs, and torso. When a patient was placed in it, attendants would firmly fasten these straps to prevent movement. The chair was often bolted to the floor or a fixed point to ensure the patient could not escape or struggle free. Sitting in the restraint chair meant complete immobilization. The patient was forced to remain upright, unable to shift or adjust their position, often for hours or even days at a time. The experience of being confined in a restraint chair was profoundly distressing. The straps would dig into the skin, causing pain or discomfort as circulation was restricted. The patient could not scratch an itch, shift weight to relieve numbness, or tend to any immediate physical discomfort. The inability to move could lead to muscle cramps, stiffness, and a growing sense of helplessness. Mentally, the immobilization could provoke fear, panic, or a deep sense of isolation. Being trapped in a fixed position, cut off from interaction, and unable to express needs or distress. Another method was the use of cold wraps, sometimes called wet packs. These involved wrapping the patient tightly in wet sheets or cloths soaked in cold water, then covering them with dry blankets. The cold wraps were intended to calm agitated patients by lowering body temperature and restricting movement, similar to an early form of hydrotherapy. The cold water could be shocking and uncomfortable, especially in chilly conditions, and the constriction made it difficult to move or breathe deeply. Being wrapped in cold packs could feel suffocating and disorienting. The shock of the cold would initially cause shivering, goosebumps, and a numbing sensation. Over time, the wet cloths could cling uncomfortably to the skin, dampening clothing and making the patient feel chilled and vulnerable. For some, the cold packs induced a calming effect, dulling agitation. For others, they increased anxiety and distress, heightening feelings of being trapped and punished rather than cared for. Aside from these, other restraints included straitjackets, thick canvas jackets with long sleeves tied at the back to prevent arm movement, and leather cuffs or straps used to bind wrists or ankles to beds or chairs. The straitjacket forced patients into a rigid posture, making even basic movements impossible. Leather cuffs, sometimes lined with metal buckles, could chafe or bruise skin, causing pain and injury over time. Being subjected to any form of physical restraint was often humiliating and terrifying. Patients were typically restrained only after behavior was deemed dangerous or uncontrollable, which could itself result from fear, confusion, or untreated mental illness. The experience could reinforce feelings of powerlessness and despair, as the restraints removed any control patients had over their own bodies. Attendants were responsible for applying restraints, often doing so abruptly and with little explanation. The process might involve multiple attendants forcibly holding the patient down, adding to the trauma. Once restrained, patients might be left alone or monitored closely, sometimes for hours on end, with minimal comfort or reassurance. The use of restraints reflected the harsh realities of asylum life in the 1800s, a time when empathy for mental illness was limited, and the priority was containment rather than healing. While restraints sometimes prevented harm, they also contributed to physical suffering and emotional distress, leaving lasting scars on those who endured them. The atmosphere inside an 1800s asylum was never truly quiet. Even in the moments that seemed still, a patient's ears were rarely allowed peace. Sounds were constant companions, sometimes faint and distant, sometimes overwhelming and close, but they were always there, echoing off stone corridors and passing beneath heavy doors. What a patient heard from others around them played a huge part in shaping the emotional weight of the day. There were the cries, raw, human cries that didn't follow any pattern or rhythm. Sometimes they were loud and sudden, like a person being startled awake from a nightmare or overwhelmed by fear. Other times, they were long, drawn-out wails, slow and aching, carrying grief, confusion, or hopelessness deep into the air around them. These cries came from all corners of the building, drifting from shared wards, individual cells, isolation rooms, or just someone sitting alone in a hallway, rocking back and forth, lost in their own world. These sounds didn't need translation. Even if you didn't know the person, you could feel what they felt. Laughter was another sound that cut through the asylum's air, but not the kind you might hear at a park or dinner table. This laughter had an edge to it, often sharp, high-pitched, and seemingly disconnected from joy. It would erupt suddenly, out of silence, without warning. It might come from someone pacing in a circle, talking to no one, or it might ring out from a patient during mealtime, fixated on something only they could see or understand. Sometimes it was unsettling, like hearing a child laugh in the middle of a graveyard. Other times, it was sad, because it wasn't happiness, it was release, maybe even desperation. In the quietest hours, laughter might echo alone in the dark, outlasting the person who made it. Shouting was another layer of daily life. Arguments between patients could break out, especially when tempers were short or confusion blurred social lines. One patient might scream nonsense into the hallway, another might shout at invisible figures on the wall. At times, the shouts were pleas, begging to be let out, to be heard, to be understood. Sometimes they were angry, sometimes frightened, and sometimes they made no sense at all. Some patients yelled for family, for a child they missed, for a spouse they believed was just down the hall. And yet no matter how loud they shouted, no one came. In between the chaos, there were periods of haunting silence. Not the kind of silence that feels calm or soothing, but a deep, suffocating quiet that wrapped around the building like a cold sheet. It wasn't total stillness, You could still hear breathing, footsteps in the distance, the occasional clank of metal, but it was the kind of quiet that made every small noise feel louder, more deliberate, more alive. It was during these silent stretches that many patients felt the most alone. Without words or distraction, the mind was left to wander, sometimes far away, sometimes in circles, sometimes into dark places it couldn't escape from. Mixed into all of this were the murmurs, the low, hushed voices of patients talking to themselves or whispering to someone who wasn't there. Some repeated the same word or sentence over and over, softly, like a chant or a prayer. Others whispered long, rambling thoughts, explaining things no one else could hear or see. The murmurs would rise and fall like wind, drifting down halls and sneaking through cracks in doors. They were constant in some parts of the asylum, like a river of lost thoughts flowing under the surface of everything. There were the mechanical sounds, too, the sounds of the institution itself. Keys jingling at a guard's belt. The creak of an old wooden door opening slowly. The slam of a heavy one closing with finality. The shuffle of slippers on tile as patients were led from one room to another. The occasional crash of something being knocked over. The dull thump of someone hitting a wall or dropping to the floor. Every sound meant something. Every cry, every laugh, every shout told a story. In a place where words were often lost or ignored, sound became its own language. To live in the asylum was to live in the middle of a storm of voices, some real, some imagined, and to try to hold onto your own voice amid the noise. Water therapy, or hydrotherapy as it was often called, was a common method used in 1800s asylums to treat mental illness. At the time, many doctors believed that water had healing properties, not just for the body, but for the mind as well. The thinking was that warm water could soothe agitation, and cold water could shock the brain into clarity or bring down intense emotions. The truth, however, was often far more uncomfortable. For many patients, water therapy was not calming or curative. It was confusing, humiliating, and, in some cases, deeply distressing. The most frequent form of hydrotherapy was the prolonged bath. Patients were placed in large wooden or porcelain tubs filled with warm water, and they might be kept there for hours, or sometimes even days. These weren't short, relaxing soaks. Instead, they were designed to fully submerge the patient's body, usually with just the head poking out. Patients were often strapped into the tub using canvas or leather covers that stretched over the top like a tight sheet. This kept them from getting out. Some of the canvas covers had holes for the patient's head and arms, others didn't. There was no moving freely, no sitting up, no escape. The water was kept at a specific temperature, not too hot, not too cold, just warm enough to prevent hypothermia, and it was carefully monitored. An attendant would check the thermometer regularly and add more hot or cold water as needed. A patient might be left like that for 4 or 5 hours at a time, completely still. The theory was that this would calm the nerves and quiet the mind. For those who were anxious, manic, or overly stimulated, it was believed that soaking would soften the extremes of their behavior. But the feeling of being held in place for that long, without choice or explanation, often did the opposite. It could be maddening. You couldn't scratch your face if you itched. You couldn't sit up if your back began to ache. The water cooled over time, and even when it was warm, the air in the room wasn't always comfortable. Many patients described the chill that settled into their bones as the hours passed. You couldn't talk much while in the tub, not to others, not to staff, not even to yourself. It was a kind of forced stillness that could feel like drowning in silence. Cold water treatments were used more harshly. These weren't gentle showers or even cold baths. Patients might be wrapped in ice-cold wet sheets and left on a bed or table. This was called the wet sheet pack. Layers of soaked fabric were tightly wound around the body, sometimes with only the face left exposed, and left for hours. In some places, patients were also hosed down with cold water from a pump or made to sit under a stream of icy water from above. These treatments weren't just about calming, they were also used as punishment for behavior considered disruptive or defiant. The cold was sharp, biting, and unforgiving. Muscles would tense, teeth would chatter, and shivering would often go on for the entire length of the treatment. The staff claimed this reduced aggression or overexcitement, but to those on the receiving end, it felt like something much darker. You weren't calmed, you were subdued. The chill got into your joints, into your breath, into your thoughts. It stripped you down to your most basic feelings: fear, discomfort, and helplessness. There were also douche treatments, where cold water was sprayed directly onto the patient from a hose, sometimes with great force. These were often done standing or seated, and sometimes patients were strapped to a chair or a bench. The water would be poured or sprayed over the head and shoulders repeatedly. It wasn't just shocking, it was overwhelming. The noise, the force, the sensation of not being able to move freely, it was deeply traumatic for some. It was meant to jolt the patient back into rational thought or obedience, but it rarely did anything other than inspire dread. Some patients learned to go still and silent during hydrotherapy, hoping that compliance would mean shorter treatments. Others resisted, and their resistance only confirmed the staff's belief that more water was needed. You weren't asked if you wanted to be treated. You weren't told how long it would last. You were simply led, or dragged, into the therapy room, undressed, and placed in water, wrapped in wet sheets, or showered against your will. Even when used with good intentions, hydrotherapy in the 1800s lacked understanding of what patients were truly experiencing. It confused physical sensation with emotional healing. It treated symptoms rather than causes. For patients, it often left lasting memories, not of being helped, but of being restrained, stripped, and drowned in routine. Electrotherapy in the 1800s was one of the more frightening and misunderstood treatments a patient could be subjected to in an asylum. At the time, electricity was still something of a marvel, a mysterious force with both promise and fear attached to it. Medical professionals were only beginning to understand how electricity worked, and even less so how it interacted with the human body. And yet, despite how little they truly knew, they believed it had the potential to reset the brain, to break through mental disturbances, and perhaps even to restore sanity. From the point of view of a patient, electrotherapy was something ominous. There was no choice involved. If a doctor decided you needed it, you were going to get it. No questions. No explanations. You were simply told to follow, or more likely, taken by the arm and led, or forced, into a treatment room that smelled faintly of metal, burnt dust, and old wires. The room might have had strange machines with dials, cords, and knobs. Some resembled wooden boxes with glass tubes and spinning wheels. Others had thick cords and copper pieces, and they gave off a low hum when switched on. The process was as bewildering as it was terrifying. In many cases, a patient would be strapped into a chair, sometimes with leather restraints at the wrists and ankles, sometimes just held in place by attendants. Electrodes, usually made of metal, were applied to different parts of the body. Sometimes they were attached to the temples, sometimes to the arms or the back of the neck. In some older forms, wires were even dipped into a saline solution and then placed directly onto the skin to help conduct the current. Then came the jolt. It wasn't always a violent shock, not at first. Sometimes it started with a low pulse, a strange tingling that made the muscles twitch. But other times, especially when doctors were impatient or believed the patient needed a stronger dose, the current was turned up high right away. The feeling was unnatural. It wasn't like a normal pain, it was deeper, more confusing. Your muscles would seize without your control. Your head might snap back, your fingers curl tight, your teeth clench. You couldn't scream if you wanted to. Your whole body would tense as if struck by lightning, then collapse into a jittery, shaky state afterward. And then it might happen again. And again. Some patients passed out. Others vomited. Some wept uncontrollably or became completely silent. The confusion was just as overwhelming as the physical sensations. You didn't know when the current would come, or how long it would last. Some were subjected to this therapy weekly, others more frequently. The official story was that it would help regulate the brain's electrical pathways, cure hysteria, quiet violent outbursts, or rouse those lost in depression. But in reality, most patients didn't understand what was happening to them. They only knew that the electricity made them feel helpless, afraid, and violated. The worst part for many wasn't even the physical pain, it was the anticipation. The walk to the treatment room was long and quiet. Attendants might grip your arms tighter than usual. The doors would close behind you. The doctor wouldn't look at you like a person, but like a puzzle or a broken thing. He would adjust knobs, glance at a chart, and begin. You weren't asked how you felt, and no one checked on you afterward beyond making sure you were still breathing and conscious. There was no kindness. No soft voices. Just a sense of being experimented on, like a living subject in a cold test. The after effects varied. Some patients were left dazed for hours, struggling to remember their names or speak properly. Others suffered headaches or blurred vision. Some even developed tremors or had difficulty sleeping. But these effects were dismissed. What mattered to the doctors was whether the patient became quieter, more compliant, less trouble. If they sat still during roll call or stopped shouting during the night, then the treatment was declared a success. Not all asylums used electrotherapy. Some were too rural or poorly funded to afford the equipment. But in the larger institutions, especially in cities, it became more common as the century wore on. Patients learned to fear the sound of the machine being wheeled down the hall, the sight of wires, or the feel of metal near their skin. And even those who weren't subjected to it directly often lived in fear of being chosen next. For many, the memory of electrotherapy stayed longer than anything else. It wasn't something you forgot. The sensation of being shocked, of losing control of your own body, of sitting helpless in a chair while strange men adjusted dials and wrote notes, it carved itself into the mind. Some tried to make sense of it, to believe it was meant to help them. Others gave up and accepted it as part of asylum life. But none of them walked away unchanged. It was a reminder that, once inside the asylum, your body was no longer your own, and neither was your mind. A medical exam in the 1800s asylum was not the kind of experience most people think of when they imagine a visit to the doctor. There was no warm greeting, no comforting words, no gentle reassurance. It wasn't about understanding the patient or building trust. It was about observation, control, classification, and more often than not, humiliation. When you were called in for an exam, there was no privacy. A matron or an attendant would appear beside your bed or wherever you happened to be and tell you it was time. You couldn't say no. You didn't even get to ask why. You were expected to stand and follow. If you hesitated, they might take your arm and steer you. If you refused outright, they'd bring another attendant and you'd be dragged, eyes down, arms held, through the hallways while other patients watched. The exam room was cold, always cold, even in summer. It smelled like chalk, sweat, alcohol, and sometimes old sickness. There were narrow wooden tables covered with stained cloth, and cabinets full of tools most patients didn't recognize. Instruments made of metal, glass, leather, and wood. Things with strange shapes, some with long necks, some with clamps, some that looked more like tools from a butcher's shop than anything a healer would use. You weren't told what they were for. And even if you asked, no one answered. The doctor usually didn't look at you at first. He looked at the papers. A file. Something with your name scrawled at the top. He might say your name aloud, not to greet you, but to confirm you were the right person. Then he would ask you to sit, or to lie back. Sometimes he wouldn't ask at all. Sometimes the attendants would push your shoulders gently, or not so gently, until you were where they wanted you. There was no comfort in the way he spoke. If he did speak. Some didn't. They muttered to themselves, or dictated to a nurse or assistant who stood in the corner scribbling notes. The questions they asked were strange, disconnected. Do you feel sadness in the morning? Do you think others are watching you? Have you had sinful thoughts? They weren't looking for conversation. They were looking for evidence. Proof of illness. A box to check. The physical part of the exam could be worse. They checked your eyes, your teeth, your hands, the shape of your skull. Especially the skull. In those days, many doctors still believed in phrenology, the idea that the shape and size of your head could reveal your personality and mental condition. They'd press along your scalp with their fingers, muttering to themselves, noting a bump here or a hollow there. You never knew what it meant, and they rarely explained. Throughout the exam, the doctor might frown or nod or jot something down. You'd try to read his face for clues. Was he satisfied? Was he angry? Did he see something bad? You never knew. Most of the time, they didn't tell you anything. They closed the folder and gave a short nod to the attendant, and that meant it was over. Sometimes, after the exam, they made changes. Maybe they adjusted your medication. Maybe they moved you to a different ward. Maybe you weren't allowed outside for a while. You didn't get an explanation, just new rules, new restrictions, maybe a stronger dose of whatever they gave you before bed. You'd lie in your bed that night trying to figure out what the doctor had seen. Was it in your eyes? Was it something you said? Or did he already decide what you were the moment you walked in the room? And you weren't examined only once. Some patients were called in every month. Others, more often. You never knew what would trigger it. A bad dream. A whispered comment. A missed step in the hallway. If you cried too loudly or didn't cry at all. The line between wellness and illness was thin in the eyes of the doctors, and you had no control over where they drew it. To the doctors, it was all routine. Notes, names, measurements, symptoms. But to the patients, every exam was a reminder that you were not your own. That your body and mind belonged to someone else now. Someone with a pen, a chart, and a cold metal stethoscope who didn't call you by name, only patient, number, or case. The way doctors diagnosed mental illness in the 1800s was based more on guesswork, moral judgment, and outdated beliefs than on any kind of scientific understanding. Psychiatry was still in its infancy, and many doctors didn't truly understand the workings of the human mind. Their knowledge came from books written by other doctors, theories passed down from older institutions, and from their own observations, which were often shaped by cultural and religious ideas of right and wrong. They believed mental illness could be seen, touched, even measured. And often, they thought it was something that could be fixed, or at least controlled, by force, structure, and punishment. One of the most common diagnoses for women was hysteria. It was a word that meant everything and nothing at once. Hysteria could be used to explain nervousness, sadness, too much talking, not enough talking, emotional outbursts, silence, or even a refusal to obey. A woman who questioned her husband or didn't fit into the expectations of a proper lady might be labeled as hysterical. The diagnosis came from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, and many doctors believed it was caused by problems with the womb. Some said it moved around inside the body, causing madness wherever it went. It sounds absurd now, but back then, it was accepted by many as fact. Hysteria became a catch-all term for anything a doctor didn't understand in a female patient. It was easy. It made them feel in control. And it almost always led to treatment, whether the woman wanted it or not. For men and women alike, another common diagnosis was melancholia, or what we would now call depression. But to the doctors of the time, melancholia wasn't seen as a real illness of the brain or emotions. It was considered a weakness, a sign of moral failure, or even laziness. People with melancholia might be described as brooding, overly thoughtful, withdrawn, or unmotivated. Instead of treating the person with compassion, they were often treated with suspicion or frustration. Some doctors believed hard work would cure melancholia, so patients were forced into physical labor. Others believed it was caused by spiritual emptiness and prescribed prayer, church, or confession. And for many, the cure was simple isolation, removing the patient from society and hoping they'd snap out of it on their own. There was also mania, which could be diagnosed when someone acted with what seemed like too much energy or excitement. Loud speech, quick movements, bursts of laughter, even dancing or singing too much could be labeled as mania. Mania was feared because it was seen as unpredictable. And people with this diagnosis were often the ones restrained the most, tied to chairs, wrapped in cold sheets, or kept in padded cells. Lunacy was another term thrown around often, based on the old belief that the phases of the moon affected the human mind. The idea was that a full moon could cause madness. Doctors would sometimes chart the moon alongside their patient notes, looking for connections between behavior and lunar cycles. The term lunatic came directly from this belief and was commonly used in medical records, court documents, and daily conversation. Some patients were labeled with monomania, meaning they had an obsession or delusion centered on a single subject. It could be religious fervor, political ideas, or the belief that they were someone else, like Napoleon or a famous poet. Doctors thought these cases were strange, almost comical, and treated them with more curiosity than care. They'd observe the patient, ask questions about their obsession, and write long descriptions in their journals. Rarely did they try to understand what was behind it. Moral insanity was another favorite. It didn't mean the person lacked a conscience. It was a term used when a patient behaved in a way the doctor or society considered immoral or improper. This could include lying, stealing, or even just being too bold or outspoken. The word insane was applied more to behavior than to actual mental health. If you didn't fit in, if you broke the rules, if you made people uncomfortable, that could be enough to label you as insane. There were also diagnoses rooted in class and race. Poor people were more likely to be labeled as feeble-minded or degenerate, simply because of their background. Immigrants, especially those who didn't speak English or who came from unfamiliar cultures, were sometimes diagnosed as insane for speaking their own language or practicing unfamiliar customs. Black patients, when admitted at all, were often subjected to harsher treatment and given fewer opportunities for recovery. The system was built on bias, and it showed in the way doctors made their diagnoses. Many doctors used phrenology, the measurement of skull bumps, to support their diagnoses. If a patient had a certain bump or dip on their skull, it was said to indicate madness, criminal tendencies, or a weak character. There were charts in the doctor's offices showing which part of the skull related to which trait: anger, patience, joy, deceit. It was treated as science, though it had no basis in fact. Patients had no way to challenge these ideas. Once the diagnosis was written, it followed them forever. What made these diagnoses even more damaging was that they rarely led to meaningful treatment. Once labeled, a patient's fate was sealed. The diagnosis became their identity, not just to the doctors, but to the attendants, the other patients, and even themselves. They were no longer a person with fears, hopes, or memories. They were the hysteric, or the melancholic, or the lunatic in Ward 4. And many diagnoses came without proper evaluation at all. Sometimes a family member brought someone in and told the doctor they were acting strangely. That was enough. If a husband said his wife was hysterical, she was admitted. If a son said his mother was melancholy, she was locked away. There were few checks, no second opinions, no appeals. Once you were in, it was nearly impossible to get out. These outdated and often cruel labels shaped every part of life in the asylum. They decided where a patient lived, what treatments they received, how they were spoken to, and whether they were ever released. They stripped people of their humanity and turned mental health into a lifelong sentence. And all the while, the doctors believed they were helping, because the system told them they were right. Waiting for letters or visitors in an 1800s asylum was a deeply emotional experience, one that could bring hope, but more often brought silence. In those long, slow hours between chores, meals, and treatments, the thought of a letter arriving or a familiar face showing up at the visitor's bench was often the one thing that kept a patient's mind from sinking deeper into despair. For some, the possibility of contact with the outside world felt like a lifeline, thin, frayed, but still there. For others, it became a source of pain, a reminder of the life they once had, and the people who no longer came. Patients didn't always know when mail might come. There wasn't a predictable post schedule shared with them. Letters, when they arrived, were often read by attendants first or even censored by staff. Some never made it into patients' hands at all. A relative might write once, or twice, and then stop. The silence that followed wasn't explained. Patients were left to wonder whether the letter got lost, whether someone had decided not to send it, or whether they had simply been forgotten. There were days when a patient might sit by the window, eyes fixed on the gravel path that led to the front gate, watching every time a carriage rolled up. If someone stepped out, they would lean forward slightly, hoping it might be a brother, a mother, a daughter. They would watch the shape of the figure, how they walked, how they held their hat or shawl. And if that person turned out to be someone else's visitor, the disappointment could sink like a weight in their chest. Sometimes, they would turn away quickly to hide the reaction, pretending not to care. Other times, they couldn't hide it. You might see a lip tremble, or a quiet sigh escape, or a tear fall when they thought no one was looking. In some wards, there was a designated visitors' hour, once a week, or maybe less, and patients were lined up and checked beforehand. Those whose families had written or arranged a visit would be called out, cleaned up a little, and brought to a bench or a cold waiting room. The rest would simply return to their routine, pretending they hadn't been hoping. The ones left behind might mutter to themselves or stare at the wall. Some would speak out loud to family members they couldn't see, acting out imaginary conversations to fill the silence. Others just sat still, still hoping, even as the minutes dragged on. The pain of not being visited wasn't just sadness, it was a slow erosion of identity. When no one came, and no one wrote, it began to feel like maybe you no longer existed in the outside world. That maybe your name was no longer spoken anywhere beyond those stone walls. Some patients would ask attendants repeatedly, "Has anything come for me?" And each time, they were told no. They might smile politely the first few times, but after weeks, or months, or years, the question turned into a whisper, and then into silence. There were patients who wrote letters, too, sometimes dozens of them. They would ask for a pen and paper, and with shaking hands, they would write to their spouse, or their children, or an old friend. They would pour their hearts into the paper, talking about the food, the cold, the people in the ward. Some would write poetry. Others would just write their name over and over again, as if to prove they were still there. And when the letters were handed to the staff, they might or might not be mailed. The patient would wait anyway. The rare times someone did arrive, when a familiar face did cross the yard, it felt like the clouds parted. Eyes would widen, backs would straighten, hands would reach out. The conversations were awkward sometimes, stilted, because what could you say? There wasn't much to share except the pain and the slowness of time. But still, the touch of a hand, the sound of a voice that didn't echo off stone walls, it was like being human again, if only for a few minutes. Then the visitor would leave. And that was sometimes harder than the waiting. Watching them walk away, back into a world of freedom, of choices, of lightness, and being led back into the echoing hallways of the asylum, that moment could be unbearable. Some patients would cry. Some would go quiet. Others would lash out in frustration, their emotions boiling over in ways the staff didn't understand. And then it would be days, weeks, months again before another name was called. Before the hope flickered up once more. For many, the waiting never ended. Some patients died without ever hearing from a single person outside. No letter. No visit. Nothing. And even in their confusion, even in their illness, a part of them still seemed to know. That emptiness settled into their eyes, into their posture. They stopped asking. They stopped waiting by the window. They folded into the walls around them like they were part of the furniture. But still, for some, even in the face of endless silence, a small bit of hope stayed alive. A belief, however faint, that one day, someone might come. That someone might still remember their name. The religious services in an 1800s asylum were often one of the few structured breaks in the week. A moment when patients were brought together, not for work or treatment, but to listen, to sit still, and to participate in something that, at least on the surface, resembled life outside the walls. The asylum chapel was rarely grand. In most places, it was a small, cold room with rows of hard benches, some missing slats, some uneven. The air smelled faintly of wax from the old candles placed at the front, and sometimes of dust or mildew from the hymn books that were passed around, many of them faded or frayed at the corners. The chapel walls were plain, sometimes just bare stone or chipped white plaster. A wooden cross usually hung at the front, crooked in some places, centered in others, depending on who had last tried to straighten it. There might be a single stained glass window, its colors muted from years of grime and age, casting dim light across the worn floorboards when the sun hit it just right. More often, though, there were just small, narrow windows too high up to look through, letting in pale daylight that didn't warm the room but at least made it less shadowy. The preacher varied from asylum to asylum. In some cases, he was a full-time chaplain employed by the institution, wearing a modest black cassock, his face lined with years of listening and speaking in rooms like this. In others, he was a visiting minister, arriving once a week or every other week, greeted by the head doctor or a senior attendant. These preachers weren't always kind. Some preached fire and punishment, speaking loudly about sin and damnation, believing that mental illness was the result of moral failing. They spoke in stern tones, glancing across the congregation like they expected someone to bolt at any moment. Others were gentler, with softer voices, reading familiar verses and offering a kind word here and there, trying, perhaps futilely, to reach people whose minds were far away or too wounded to hear. Patients were brought in by ward, often in groups led by attendants who lined them up and marched them to the chapel in silence. Some patients walked quietly, folding their hands in front of them, heads down. Others shuffled, muttering or rocking slightly, sometimes needing gentle pushes or firm guidance to keep them moving forward. A few resisted altogether and had to be left behind or forcibly escorted, depending on their condition. Once seated, patients weren't always still. Some swayed. Some whispered. Some laughed at odd moments. Occasionally, someone would cry quietly or mumble to themselves through the entire service. Others stared straight ahead, eyes vacant. But there were also those who genuinely listened, who looked up at the preacher and tried to follow the sermon, who joined in when hymns were sung, their voices trembling but determined. For some, the rituals, bowing heads in prayer, mouthing familiar verses, standing when told, brought comfort. They remembered doing these things in churches outside, with family members sitting beside them. Here, even though the space was colder and the faces around them less familiar, the rituals still touched something inside. They made some feel human again. When the preacher read from the Bible, his voice echoed slightly in the stillness of the chapel. Passages from Psalms were common, verses about suffering, about endurance, about divine mercy. Sometimes, patients mouthed the words silently, following along from memory. Others sat with their hands folded tightly, eyes closed, as if willing the words to wrap around them and take them somewhere else. During hymns, if there were enough hymnals to go around, some tried to sing. Their voices wavered, some off-key, some too soft to hear, others loud and startling. A few sang not at all, simply staring ahead or fidgeting with the buttons on their coats or the hem of their dresses. Not all patients understood what was happening, and not all cared. But there were always a few who did, who clung to the rhythm of the chapel service as if it was the only steady thing in their life. For those, Sunday mornings in the asylum chapel became a kind of anchor. They counted the days until the next one. They remembered the verses, and whispered them at night when they couldn't sleep. They folded their hands the way they were taught as children, hoping someone, somewhere, might still be listening. The preacher, when the service ended, would usually offer a final prayer, standing with one hand raised or folded in front of him. Patients were led out again in lines, some more orderly than others. There was rarely conversation afterward. It wasn't a social gathering. But there was often a change in the air, a stillness that came from the quiet gathering, the low voices, the shared ritual. For some, it lingered for a while, a brief sense of peace amid the long, uncertain days. And when patients returned to their wards, the chapel already behind them, the wooden benches empty again, the room once more cold and quiet, it would feel like the rest of the week all over again. The sounds of locks, of footsteps, of doors closing echoed once more. But in the back of their minds, a hymn might still hum, or a verse might echo, words that gave them something, however faint, to hold on to. Reading materials in 1800s asylums were often scarce, and when they did exist, they were tightly controlled. Patients were not freely given books to browse through or newspapers to spread out across their laps. What they were allowed to read, if they were allowed to read at all, was chosen by attendants, doctors, or the asylum's chaplain. Reading was considered a privilege, not a right, and in many cases, whether someone had access to words on a page depended on how they behaved, how they were diagnosed, and whether the staff believed it might help or disturb their mind. One of the most common books found in these institutions was the Bible. The asylum might have had only a few copies, and these were usually worn, with thin pages and frayed bindings. Some were small enough to fit in a pocket, others were large and heavy and kept on a communal table under supervision. The Bibles often belonged to the asylum itself, stamped or marked to prevent theft, though occasionally, a patient was allowed to keep one brought by a family member. Those were more personal, sometimes with names or dates written in careful cursive on the inside cover. Patients who were calm and seen as stable might be allowed to read the Bible during quiet hours, perhaps while sitting in a corner of the day room, or at night before bed, with what little light filtered through the high windows. Some read it aloud to themselves in a whispering voice. Others followed the lines with their fingers, slowly, as if trying to remember or memorize them. For a few, the Bible was a comfort, a link to a world outside the asylum's walls, to a life they'd once known. The verses were familiar, and even if they couldn't focus long enough to understand all the words, the rhythm of the text gave them something solid to hold on to. It made the chaos around them feel slightly quieter. Pamphlets were another kind of material sometimes given to patients. These were usually religious in nature, tracts that warned against sin or urged prayer, often printed in bulk and handed out to asylums by religious organizations or charity groups. They were made of cheap paper, usually just a few folded pages stapled together, and covered topics like repentance, salvation, or moral guidance. Titles might read The Way to Peace or Thoughts for the Sorrowful. They weren't entertaining or even particularly comforting for most people, but for those with a religious upbringing, they might have provided something to focus on. Others found them confusing or ignored them altogether, letting the pages crumple under their hands or fall to the floor unnoticed. Newspapers, when they were available, were heavily censored. Patients weren't allowed to read stories of crime, scandal, or politics for fear that such things would excite their minds. If newspapers were shared at all, they were often outdated copies, with pages torn or folded, and only certain sections, maybe the weather, community notices, or farming news, left intact. Staff might read aloud from them during a calm afternoon, skipping entire paragraphs deemed too upsetting. Some patients listened with glazed eyes, while others strained to catch every word, hungry for any hint of life beyond the asylum walls. Very occasionally, patients were allowed access to old books from a donated collection, usually religious or educational works, and often worn to the point of nearly falling apart. There might be a book about geography, one about natural history, or a dull volume of sermons. If someone was literate and still able to focus, they might read these books cover to cover, not because the content was thrilling, but because it was anything, to do. The days in the asylum were long, and for those who remembered a life filled with books or study, reading, even something dry and outdated, became a form of survival. However, many patients never saw a single book during their stay. Some couldn't read, and some had been deemed too unstable to be trusted with pages that could be torn, rolled, or eaten. For these individuals, literacy became just another thing taken away, another part of their identity erased. And for those who did have access, their reading was rarely private. There was always the sense of being watched, by attendants, by nurses, even by other patients. There was no cozy corner, no personal library, no quiet escape into stories or knowledge. Still, for the rare ones who held a Bible in their lap, or traced a finger along the edge of a news article, or turned the thin pages of a devotional book under flickering light, the presence of words, printed, ordered, and familiar, was something close to peace. It was the sound of their own mind, working through lines and verses, trying to stay whole in a place built to take away the world outside. Reading didn't change the bars on the windows or the locks on the doors, but it did let some part of the world sneak in through ink and paper, whispering that maybe, somewhere beyond the gates, there was still more waiting to be lived. Dinner in the asylum came with its own kind of weight. It marked the final gathering of the day, the last structured activity before the long stretch of night when the halls quieted and patients were left to their own thoughts, or to the persistent sounds that echoed through the building long after the lights were dimmed. But before that silence came, there was the ritual of the evening meal, an event that was more about routine than nourishment, more about order than comfort. The dining room at dinner time was often dimmer than it had been during breakfast or lunch. Depending on the time of year, it might be dark outside already, and the lamps on the walls gave off a yellowish glow that left much of the room in shadow. The long wooden tables looked the same, and the benches were just as hard. There was no music, no small talk, no clatter of cheerful silverware. The meal was conducted in near silence or under the sharp supervision of the attendants, who walked slowly along the aisles between tables, arms folded, eyes scanning for any disruptions. The food itself was plain, repetitive, and often bland to the point of being difficult to eat. A common dinner might include a scoop of boiled potatoes, watery turnips, or overcooked cabbage that had long since lost its flavor. Sometimes, there was a stew made from leftover vegetables and a few scraps of tough meat, gristle and bone included. The stew was ladled into tin bowls and served warm, but rarely hot. On other nights, there might be a dry biscuit or a thick piece of bread, served with a bit of weak tea or lukewarm broth. Butter was rare, and spices even rarer. If meat was included, it was typically stringy, overcooked, and tough to chew. If it was fish, it often tasted as though it had sat too long in a barrel of brine. There were no individual portions in the sense of choice or preference. Every person received the same thing, scooped in nearly identical measures. There were no seconds unless a patient was exceptionally underweight and under specific medical watch. The trays were passed down the line, and the staff watched to ensure everyone ate. Leaving food untouched could result in consequences. Accusations of being uncooperative, of not trying hard enough to recover, or of rejecting the institution's help. Some patients stared at their bowls for long minutes before lifting their spoons. Others ate mechanically, not tasting anything, just going through the motions as they had every evening before. A few clutched their food protectively, guarding it from imagined threats or nearby patients. There were always some who devoured their meals quickly, driven by hunger or nerves, finishing long before others had taken a second bite. There were others who had to be coaxed to eat at all, or who needed to be watched closely to prevent them from hiding the food, refusing it, or worse, vomiting it later in secret. The mood in the room was heavy, subdued. Conversations were rare and discouraged. If voices did rise above a whisper, an attendant would often hush them with a warning glance or a tap on the table. Laughter was viewed with suspicion, as though any joy was misplaced or dangerous. The occasional clang of a dropped spoon, the scrape of a chair, or the cough of a patient were the main sounds that filled the air. Those noises echoed against the hard walls and high ceilings, bouncing around the room like reminders of how hollow everything felt. Sometimes, a patient would sit frozen, staring down at their plate, disconnected from the moment. The smell of the food, a mix of overcooked vegetables, boiled meats, and old tea, would drift through the room, settling into clothing, hair, and memory. For those who had been in the asylum for months or years, the scent of dinner had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. For newcomers, it could be nauseating, especially if they had once known better meals, family kitchens, or lively dining tables. On some occasions, dinner was served with a side of medication. An attendant might come around with a tray of pills or liquid doses, handed out individually. Patients were expected to swallow them under watchful eyes, sometimes followed by a sip of water from a communal tin cup. These medicines, often bitter, chalky, or foul-tasting, were taken in silence, without explanation. You weren't told what it was or why it was being given. You were simply expected to take it. After dinner, patients were dismissed in lines or small groups. They stood slowly from the benches, often stiff or sore, and were led back toward their wards or to whatever evening activity was scheduled, if any. There was no dessert. No lingering at the table. No seconds. The meal ended when the last spoon scraped the bottom of the last bowl, and the attendants began to collect the trays with practiced speed. For many, the feeling after dinner wasn't satisfaction. It was just another kind of weariness. A tired stomach. A heavy chest. The dull ache of another day done, another evening slipping into night with little change and no end in sight. And as the footsteps echoed down the hallway and the trays clattered into the washing basin, dinner became a memory that blended into the long, grey sameness of asylum life. Medications in the asylum were both feared and expected, a daily ritual wrapped in mystery. For the patients, they were strange substances whose names were never fully explained, whose side effects were unpredictable, and whose purposes were always presented with vague promises of calm, balance, or simply obedience. Medicine time came with an air of finality, often treated as a medical formality and a behavioral checkpoint rolled into one. If you refused, it was noted. If you hesitated, they watched. If you questioned, you were reminded that your cooperation was part of your recovery, or at least, that's what they said. The medications themselves came in many forms. Small paper cups held white powders that dissolved into lukewarm water or weak tea. Some were crushed tablets, so bitter that the taste would cling to your tongue for hours afterward, no matter how much you drank to wash it down. Others were small chalky pills, some round, some oblong, some speckled with a reddish hue, each with a grainy texture that stuck in the throat if swallowed dry. They were rarely coated, rarely smooth, and they often dissolved too slowly or too quickly in the mouth, depending on the material. Most of them tasted metallic or sour, like iron or spoiled citrus. Then there were the liquids. These were thick, syrupy concoctions that ranged in color from murky amber to nearly black. They were stored in dark glass bottles, often unmarked or bearing faded labels written in Latin or illegible cursive. Some smelled sweet, like licorice or overripe fruit, while others reeked of alcohol, herbs, or something deeply chemical and unnatural. A few were administered with spoons, thick silver ones kept in a jar of cloudy water between doses, while others were poured into medicine cups and slid across the table with a warning nod. You drank it, or you didn't leave. The attendants were strict about medicine time. They carried clipboards or leather-bound ledgers, marking off names with pencils after confirming the dose had been taken. Some watched closely as each pill was placed on the tongue and followed with a sip of water. They would make you open your mouth afterward, lift your tongue, prove that you hadn't hidden it in your cheek. If you had, there were consequences. They'd force you to take it again, sometimes doubled. If you resisted too often, you might be strapped to a restraint chair and administered the medicine by force, pressed against your will. There were no explanations, no listed side effects, no conversations about how it made you feel. If you complained that it made you dizzy, they told you that was normal. If you said it made you nauseous, they told you to eat more. If it gave you nightmares or made your heart race or made your hands tremble uncontrollably, they might reduce the dose, or they might increase it. There was no clear system. Each patient felt like a test subject for something no one was explaining. Commonly prescribed medications included bromides for sedation, chloral hydrate as a sleep aid, and opium-based tinctures for both pain and agitation. Some received barbiturates, especially if they were prone to outbursts or hallucinations. Others were given combinations that left them dazed, unable to walk steadily or speak in full sentences. The line between calming someone and dulling their senses was very thin, and in many cases, it seemed like the goal wasn't treatment but control. A quiet patient was a good patient. A patient who slept all day was easier to manage. Patients knew who received the heavier doses. You could see it in their slow movements, their glassy eyes, their inability to sit up straight or respond to questions. Some would mutter to themselves, drool slightly, or sleep with their heads on the table. Others developed tremors or had trouble with balance, but no one adjusted their prescriptions unless it became dangerous to the staff. The concern was less about side effects and more about compliance. If the drugs made you docile, they stayed in your regimen. Medication time was usually twice a day, once in the morning and once before lights out. Both times were treated as solemn affairs. It wasn't like receiving medicine at home or in a hospital. There was no kindness, no encouragement, no bedside manner. It was business. Line up, take your dose, move along. Some patients developed deep paranoia about what they were being given. Others learned to fake swallowing, only to be caught and punished. A few became addicted to the opiates, their personalities slowly changing over time, until they no longer spoke of anything but sleep, silence, and numbness. There were also injections, thick syringes that were used sparingly but with unmistakable authority. These were for emergencies, or when someone was completely unmanageable. The needle would come out from a metal box, the vial prepared behind a closed door, and then two attendants would hold the patient still. The sting was sharp, and the result was usually immediate, a deep fog that dropped over everything like a curtain. You didn't argue after an injection. You barely remembered anything at all. As the days wore on, medication became just another part of the cycle. Patients began to associate it not with healing, but with suppression. It flattened emotions, dulled memories, slowed thought. It made you forget the edges of things, the people you once knew, the place you were in, the time of day. Some even began to crave it in a way, because when you were medicated, you didn't care so much. You didn't feel the cold as deeply. You didn't mind the shouting. You didn't notice the smell of mildew or the taste of rot in the stew. You didn't dream. You just floated. And so, each day, when the footsteps echoed down the corridor and the cart came rattling with its tiny clinking bottles, the asylum braced for another round. Some came forward willingly. Others had to be dragged. But in the end, the result was the same: swallow, sip, and sit. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another dose. At night, the asylum took on a very different character, a place where silence wasn't really silence, and darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a time when sounds, small and large, carried farther and felt heavier, almost as if the walls themselves were listening and whispering secrets back. As the lamps flickered low and attendants made their rounds, footsteps echoed down long, narrow corridors, sometimes slow and measured, other times hurried or uneven, as if someone was trying to move quickly but uncertainly through the dark. The soft shuffle of shoes on worn wooden floors or the faint clinking of keys created a rhythmic, haunting soundtrack to the night. From far away, there might be the distant cries of a patient, sometimes a low moan, sometimes a sharp, piercing scream that suddenly broke the quiet like a knife slicing through fabric. These sounds were unpredictable, sometimes lasting just a moment, other times stretching out and looping in the stillness, only to fade and then rise again. The cries could come from the isolation rooms, or from the shared wards where multiple patients slept in one large space. Occasionally, a patient might cry out in confusion or fear, while others might be weeping softly, or even laughing in a way that was eerie and unsettling. Between these cries were quieter, less obvious noises, the soft murmurs of patients talking in their sleep, or whispered conversations held in hushed tones. Sometimes, there would be coughing fits or the rattling breath of someone who was sick or old, reminding everyone of the fragility within the walls. The occasional rustling of bed sheets, the creak of a bed frame settling, or the faint scraping of a shoe against the floor added to the tapestry of nighttime sounds. The air itself felt heavy with a kind of expectant stillness, almost as if the asylum was holding its breath. The muffled thuds of distant doors closing echoed through the halls, reminding patients that though the night was quiet, they were never truly alone. Doors to rooms might open quietly for an attendance check, or sometimes slam shut. If a patient was being moved or restrained, those slamming doors were sudden, sharp, and jolting, like punctuation marks in the otherwise slow rhythm of the night. In some wings, especially the older sections, the building itself seemed alive with noise, the groan of settling wood, the whistle of cold drafts sneaking through cracks around window panes, or the faint drip of water somewhere nearby. These ambient noises filled the empty spaces between human sounds, sometimes heightening the sense of loneliness or fear. For many patients, the night was a time of heightened anxiety. The combination of isolation, darkness, and those distant, often strange sounds made it difficult to rest. Some lay awake, staring at the ceiling or the dim outlines of the room, straining to hear any sound that might explain the uneasy feeling creeping up their spines. Others tried to drown out the noises by pulling their blankets over their heads or humming quietly to themselves, seeking comfort in small distractions. The atmosphere at night was thick with the weight of unspoken fears, fear of what might come, fear of loneliness, fear of the unknown noises beyond their doors. For some, it was a restless night filled with nightmares, the echoes of daytime confusion mixing with the eerie sounds of the dark. For others, it was a long stretch of silence broken only by the routine footsteps of attendants, who moved through the building with practiced quiet, checking rooms, adjusting patients, and making sure that the fragile peace was kept. Despite the darkness, the night was never truly peaceful. The sounds were a reminder that the asylum was still very much alive, alive with people, with emotions, and with the complex, tangled histories of everyone inside. The nights could feel endless, stretching on until the first faint light of dawn began to seep through the barred windows, bringing with it the promise of a new day, and with it, new sounds, new routines, and new struggles. Trying to sleep in an 1800s asylum was a challenge unlike most can imagine today. The beds themselves were often simple, cold, and uncomfortable. Patients usually lay on narrow, wooden-framed beds with thin, worn mattresses that did little to soften the hardness beneath them. The mattresses might be stuffed with straw or horsehair, materials that could poke through worn fabric and cause constant prickling discomfort. Blankets were coarse, scratchy, and often not clean, sometimes smelling faintly of damp or musty fabric from weeks of use. Pillows were little more than lumpy sacks, offering minimal support for the head and neck. There was rarely any sense of warmth or coziness, only the bare essentials needed to keep someone barely comfortable enough to rest. The room itself wasn't conducive to sleep. The dim, flickering light of a single oil lamp or candle might be left burning for a while, casting shifting shadows on cracked plaster walls and the high, barred windows. Outside noises filtered in, sometimes the wind howled through the cracks, sometimes rain tapped insistently on the glass, and other times, the cold creaking of the old building seemed to groan in the night. Patients were bombarded by the sounds of the asylum at night, distant cries of other inmates, the occasional shout or sudden noise that jolted people awake, footsteps of attendants making their rounds, and the constant, low murmur of restless minds and bodies around them. Even silence itself felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and the unknown. For many, these noises prevented restful sleep and kept their minds alert, turning every sound into a potential threat. Fear was a constant companion during the night. Many patients felt vulnerable in these large, shared rooms, surrounded by strangers whose behavior could be unpredictable and sometimes frightening. The sense of confinement, the barred windows, and locked doors heightened feelings of being trapped and powerless. Nighttime could bring on panic or confusion, especially for those struggling with their mental health or those newly admitted and still adjusting to the harsh environment. Some patients experienced intense exhaustion from the days spent confined and the nights spent restless, but despite their weariness, falling asleep was difficult. Anxiety, nightmares, and physical discomfort kept many awake, tossing and turning through the hours. Sleep, when it came, was often broken and shallow, unable to provide true rest or relief. For others, exhaustion might eventually overcome fear, allowing them to drift into a fitful sleep, but always with one ear open, alert to the noises of the night. The mental state of the patients, whether filled with hope, despair, or confusion, affected how easily they could find rest. Those overwhelmed by their condition or by the asylum's harshness might find sleep elusive and tormenting. In all, trying to sleep in an asylum in the 1800s was a wearying ordeal, colored by discomfort, noise, fear, and the heavy weight of confinement. It was a fragile rest, one that left many waking more exhausted than before, ready to face another day trapped within these walls. During the day, the asylum was alive with a complex tapestry of sounds, each contributing to the unique and often unsettling atmosphere of the place. The very structure seemed to echo with a constant hum of activity, though it was far from peaceful. Footsteps were among the most pervasive sounds. The heavy, purposeful tread of attendants echoed sharply on the stone or wooden floors, their shoes or boots clicking and sometimes scraping, announcing their presence as they moved between wards and corridors. Sometimes their footsteps were hurried, suggesting urgency or tension, and other times slow and deliberate, as if carefully watching or searching. The patient's footsteps varied, some shuffled uncertainly, others paced nervously, and a few might even run, their feet creating uneven, hurried rhythms that pierced the otherwise steady background. The uneven gait of those unwell or frail added a haunting quality to the noise's cape. Every footfall seemed to bounce off the hard surfaces, making the corridors feel larger and emptier than they actually were. Doors played their part in the asylum's daily soundscape. Heavy wooden doors creaked loudly when opened or closed, often with a metallic clang as iron latches or bolts locked them into place. The constant opening and shutting of doors punctuated the quiet with sharp, abrupt noises. Some doors slammed when a patient was agitated, while others were gently opened by attendants checking rooms or moving patients from one area to another. The sound of keys turning in locks was a frequent, unsettling noise, reminding everyone inside of the constant control and restriction. Voices added another layer of sound. Some patients whispered softly to themselves or to others, creating a murmur that floated through the halls. Occasionally, a patient's voice would rise in sudden laughter, wild and unexpected, or in anguished cries and sobs that echoed painfully against the walls. Some shouted out commands or pleas, breaking the uneasy quiet, while others simply hummed or sang quietly, lost in their own world. The tone of voices could shift quickly from calm to agitated, reflecting the emotional volatility present. The voices of the attendants were generally firm and authoritative, sometimes sharp or stern when addressing patients. Commands, reminders, or reassurances were delivered briskly, their tones often clinical and impersonal. When attendants spoke among themselves, it was usually in hushed tones, careful not to disturb patients unnecessarily, but still loud enough to be overheard. Other background noises were subtle but constant, the faint rustling of fabric as patients shifted in their beds or clothes, the soft clinking of utensils or dishes in the dining hall, the occasional thud of objects being moved or dropped, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a large wall clock that marked time relentlessly. Water dripping from taps or leaky pipes, the occasional squeak of worn furniture, and the low murmur of the wind outside all wove into this complex acoustic environment. Sometimes, the sounds of medical instruments being prepared or adjusted could be heard, the metallic clink of tools on trays or the soft buzzing from early electrical devices. During activities, the tapping of sewing needles, the weaving of baskets, or the folding of laundry added quieter, repetitive sounds that offered brief moments of normalcy. Together, these sounds created an environment where silence was rare and often oppressive. They filled the asylum with a persistent, sometimes chaotic life, one that could be unsettling, comforting, or exhausting, depending on the moment and the state of the listener. The daily soundscape was a constant reminder of the human presence, the ongoing routines, and the confinement that defined life inside the asylum walls. For many patients confined within the walls of an 1800s asylum, hope was a fragile, flickering light, one that often centered on the possibility of leaving, of reclaiming freedom and returning to a life outside the heavy doors and barred windows. Despite the often harsh realities and treatments they endured, many held on to dreams of release, however distant or unlikely it seemed. These hopes became a refuge from the bleakness of daily life and a reminder of a world beyond the asylum's boundaries. Patients often thought of freedom as more than just leaving the physical space. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their identity, and the simple pleasures that had once filled their days. They imagined the feel of fresh air on their faces, untainted by the oppressive smells of the asylum. They longed for the warmth of sunlight without the cold chill that seeped through the asylum's stone walls. The idea of walking outside without guards or locked doors holding them back was a powerful, almost sacred hope. Many patients remembered the places they had come from: homes, fields, towns, and neighborhoods that felt like distant memories. They thought of familiar faces, the embrace of family, the voices of loved ones, and the kindness that often felt absent in the asylum's clinical and often uncaring environment. These memories could be bittersweet, stirring deep longing but also pain, as the reality of their confinement settled in. The waiting and wondering if a letter or visit might come only intensified these feelings. Beyond people and places, patients missed the freedoms most of us take for granted. The ability to choose when to eat, to move about freely, to dress as they pleased, to engage in work or hobbies that gave life meaning, and to express themselves without fear of punishment or restraint. The asylum's strict rules and routines stripped many of their autonomy, and so thoughts of freedom were intertwined with a desire to regain control over their own lives. For some, hope for release was tied to recovery, a belief that if they could show improvement, obey rules, or simply survive long enough, they might one day step beyond the asylum gates. Others held a more desperate hope, clinging to the idea that some miraculous event might grant them release, or that a loved one might intervene on their behalf. This hope could be a source of comfort, but also a source of anguish when days turned into weeks and weeks into months without change. At the same time, the reality of the asylum could sometimes cloud or crush hope. Patients could feel forgotten, abandoned by family or society, and the passing of time without contact deepened feelings of isolation and despair. The knowledge that many inside the asylum might never leave weighed heavily, but still, the human spirit's desire for freedom and connection persisted. Even small moments could reignite hope: seeing a bird outside the window, feeling the sun for a brief time in the yard, hearing news of someone's recovery or release, or receiving a letter that reminded them they were not forgotten. These glimpses of the outside world became treasures, precious breaks from the monotony and confinement. In essence, hope for freedom was a complex and powerful force for patients in the 1800s asylum. It was a mixture of yearning, memory, pain, and resilience, a mental escape from the cold walls, locked doors, and rigid routines. It sustained many through the darkest times, a reminder that beyond the asylum, life continued, waiting to be reclaimed. If the asylum had a garden, it was often a small, enclosed patch of green, a rare and precious space within the otherwise bleak and oppressive institution. Surrounded by tall, wrought-iron fences topped with sharp points or heavy wooden barriers, the garden was a world apart from the cold stone buildings and narrow hallways. It was a place designed both for control and for the fragile benefit of the patients, a controlled glimpse of nature that could offer brief relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. The garden might be modest, with a few flower beds planted with hardy blooms, marigolds, daisies, and sometimes roses if the caretakers cared to maintain them. Ivy might climb the fences or walls, softening the harsh metal and stone with its deep green leaves. Small trees or shrubs provided some shade, their branches rustling gently in the breeze. The grass, often patchy and worn from patients' footsteps, tried to grow between the paving stones or in designated areas, but the soil was frequently compacted and poor. In some gardens, rows of medicinal herbs might be grown under supervision, plants like lavender, chamomile, or sage, chosen for their calming or healing properties. For patients, time spent in the garden was a treasured break from the monotony and confinement of their rooms or wards. The garden was one of the few places where they could feel the sun on their skin, hear the birds sing, and breathe air that wasn't heavy with the scent of disinfectant and stale rooms. The feel of grass underfoot or the rough bark of a tree offered grounding sensations that reminded them of life beyond the asylum walls. The changing seasons transformed the garden's mood, from the hopeful buds of spring to the vibrant colors of summer flowers, and the quiet decay of autumn leaves, each bringing a subtle shift in atmosphere. Rules were strict in the garden, just as everywhere else. Patients were often required to stay within certain paths or seating areas, and attendants supervised to prevent escapes or outbursts. The garden was rarely a place for freedom in the full sense, but rather a carefully managed environment intended to soothe or distract. Still, for many patients, those moments outside were precious, even if brief. Some might sit quietly on benches, lost in thought or watching the clouds drift by. Others might talk softly to each other or tend small tasks like watering plants if given permission. For some, the garden was a rare place for physical movement, allowing them to stretch legs stiff from hours spent indoors. Emotionally, the garden symbolized a connection to the outside world, a reminder of what life once was or could be again. It was a place where hope could flicker, where nature's rhythms persisted despite the asylum's harshness. The scent of flowers or the feel of sunlight might stir memories of home, of freedom, and of simpler, happier times. For a moment, the garden could dissolve the walls of the asylum, if only in the mind. Yet, the garden also reflected the limitations of asylum life. Its fences and gates were constant reminders that even here, freedom was restrained. The careful order maintained by attendants underscored how even natural spaces were controlled and monitored. Patients' time there was often limited by weather, staff availability, or behavioral restrictions, so what could have been a place of healing was also a place of confinement. In some cases, tending the garden or participating in horticultural therapy was part of the daily routine, giving patients a sense of purpose and accomplishment. The physical act of planting, watering, or pruning connected patients with life cycles and growth, offering a therapeutic activity that contrasted with the more clinical or punitive treatments elsewhere in the asylum. Overall, the garden, though small and enclosed, was a vital part of asylum life for many patients. It offered sensory relief, a touch of beauty, and a fleeting sense of freedom. The green space became a refuge within the rigid walls, a place where the mind could wander beyond the confines of illness and confinement, even if just for a short while. The daily routine in an 1800s asylum moved with a weighty, relentless sameness that made time feel stretched, slow, and often unbearably dull. For patients, each day blended almost indistinguishably into the next, like an endless loop of repeating patterns and rituals with very little variation or respite. This monotony was one of the most difficult aspects of asylum life, where the passing of time was marked not by moments of joy or change, but by an unchanging cycle that seemed designed to erode hope and dull the senses. From the moment a patient woke up, often at the harsh sound of a bell or a stern attendant's call, their day was mapped out with rigid structure. There was little room for spontaneity. Morning light filtered through barred windows, but it brought no fresh promise, only the routine of rising, washing, dressing, and assembling for roll call. The same wooden benches in the dining hall, the same bland porridge and weak tea for breakfast. The same order of chores, work, and therapy that stretched across long hours. Even the sounds of the asylum contributed to this feeling. Footsteps echoed constantly on worn floors, doors clanged open and shut, voices murmured in subdued tones or occasionally erupted in sharp cries. Yet, these were the background noises to a life where nothing seemed to shift in any meaningful way. Conversations were often repetitive. New topics were rare. Days were measured not by new experiences, but by familiar routines that dulled the mind and heart. Patients knew that after breakfast came chores or occupational therapy, followed by more meals, sometimes religious services, maybe a brief time in the yard if weather allowed, and then the evening would close in with more roll calls, medication rounds, and finally the struggle to sleep. This cycle repeated relentlessly. Holidays, weekends, or special events were either absent or barely distinguishable from normal days. Without significant variation, weeks could blur into months, and months into years. The slow passage of time weighed heavily on many patients. It brought with it a creeping sense of stagnation. The lack of stimulation or meaningful activity made days drag endlessly. Without opportunities for personal expression, education, or emotional connection, many felt trapped in a limbo where nothing progressed or improved. This stagnation could intensify feelings of despair, helplessness, and isolation. Moreover, the rigid timetable was enforced by attendants who themselves followed the same repetitive schedule, further reinforcing the institutional sameness. Their mechanical, impersonal demeanor often mirrored the unchanging routine, leaving little room for warmth or individualized care. For patients, this meant a daily experience that felt less like life and more like enduring a machine designed to consume time without offering anything nourishing in return. Some patients might try to mark the passage of time by small rituals, counting days in their heads, mentally noting the phases of the moon, or recalling distant memories. Yet, these mental escapes often highlighted how trapped they truly were in a place where days crawled forward with agonizing slowness. This slow, repetitive routine was both a symptom and a tool of the asylum system. It helped maintain order and control, but at the cost of patient morale and mental health. The lack of meaningful change in daily life made it difficult for many to retain a sense of identity or purpose. It was as if the asylum itself existed outside of time, a place where life's natural rhythms were suspended or distorted. In essence, life inside the asylum was marked by a crushing sameness. Each day was a mirror of the last, each hour ticking by with a weight that felt nearly physical. This made the experience of time in the asylum not just slow, but deeply oppressive, another layer of confinement that patients had to endure alongside their illnesses and treatments. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.